Good evening, fellow alumni and friends of the University of Iowa, and welcome to this evening's lifelong learning program entitled Gridlock, a Debilitating Political Challenge. My name is Vince Nelson, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the University of Iowa Alumni Association. And I want to truly thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight to hear from this remarkable man. The Alumni Association is pleased to bring tonight's program to you as part of our annual lifelong learning series that addresses topics of interest to our Alumni Association members and to feature the many prominent University of Iowa faculty and staff. I also want to thank all of you who are members of the University of Iowa Alumni Association, for it is your membership support that allows us to develop and deliver events like this evening's program. So from all of us at the University of Iowa Alumni Association, we say thank you very, very much. I would also like to recognize two individuals from the UI Alumni Association who are responsible for developing and delivering tonight's program. I think you met both of them at the registration table, and that was Wint France Kelly and Jane Kirsch. We are also joined by two other members of the association tonight who are assisting out there, Leanne Henry and Leanne Henry, and I'm forgetting the other person, so forgive me for that right now. But to all the association members, I know Tita Kaufman is in the office or in the audience tonight. We thank you for being here and helping us. And since today is Veterans Day, I would like to take a few moments to recognize the military men and women who are currently serving locally across our great nation and overseas, along with all of our living veterans, and to salute them for their service, courage, and sacrifice. If you are one of them with us tonight, please stand and be recognized from all of us. Please stand. Now, before I introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, I would like to address with you how we would like to handle questions that you may have for him at the conclusion of his remarks. When you arrived tonight at the registration desk, you were given an event survey like this to complete and return to the registration table when you leave. For those of you who would like to ask a question, please write it on the lines below number 4 of the survey instrument. Alumni Association staff will pick it up from you during the question and answer period and give it to the speaker for his response. James A. Leach joined the College of Law after serving most recently as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Under his leadership, the NEH created a Bridging Cultures program designed to promote understanding and mutual respect for diverse groups within the United States and abroad. As part of this effort, NEH supported programs designed to expand citizen understanding of American history and values. He is best known for his 30 years of service as a representative in Congress, where he chaired the Banking and Financial Services Committee, the Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. Following his time in Congress, he was a professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and interim director of the Institute of Politics and lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He holds 13 honorary degrees and has received several awards from various organizations. He has received decorations from 2 foreign governments and is the recipient of the Wayne Morris Integrity in Politics Award, the Adlai Stevenson Award from the United Nations, the Norman Borlaug Public Service Award, and the Woodrow Wilson Medal from Princeton. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council of Foreign Relations, and formerly served as a trustee of Princeton University. And now, please welcome the Honorable Jim Leach to address tonight's topic, Gridlock, a debilitating political challenge.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, as Vince mentioned, the subject this evening is gridlock, but because this is Veterans Day, I thought I'd begin with some historical perspective on the role of the citizen soldier and how we might think about this in terms of gridlock. We have a system of government that emanated from a war, indeed the Revolutionary War, a war against the mightiest army and navy in the world at that time. The war was precipitated by a radical idea, the notion that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by a creator with inalienable rights. And I mentioned the intersection of ideas in war for several reasons. One being that we owe much to George Washington's army. And we owe much as well to the armies that followed. And sometimes armies that were used in peace. For example, Dwight David Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, to allow 7 young black students the right to integrate into a public school. We owe particular respect to those who wore the uniform in war, especially those who served in circumstances for which the country was the most divided. Critical views, for example, abound about certain military actions the United States government has chosen to take. But just think if our army in recent years had been as dysfunctional as politics are today, we'd be in a lot worse shape in the world. And thankfully, they haven't been dysfunctional. Policy may be wrong, but the kids who have served are worthy of deep respect. Because World War II was 68 years ago, at least it ended 68 years ago, and because there are fewer and fewer veterans now of that war that are with us, I thought I'd take a moment to comment about the war by referencing 2 citizens of Iowa City, Iowa. One may have been the single most important military officer of the war. His name was Lieutenant Junior Grade James Van Allen. And many of you know Jim Van Allen is the greatest space scientist. But a decade or so ago, there was a memorial service or commemoration of his life at Hancher Auditorium. And 4 people spoke from each element of his life. And the first was an elderly physicist from Johns Hopkins. And he walked up to the podium and said, "I'm going to tell you about Jim Van Allen in World War II." And everybody was kind of puzzled. And he said, "Here's what happened. When Pearl Harbor hit, Jim Van Allen was a young physicist at Johns Hopkins University, a recently minted PhD from the University of Iowa. And he thought he should join the fray. And so he's named a lieutenant in the United States Navy. Probably he suggested this to them, but they'd figured out they had a pretty bright guy on the staff. And they had a problem in the Navy that was technological. And the problem was that as shells would leave a naval vessel's guns, fully a third would explode in the air, and others might hit and not explode at all. And all navies had this problem, but the United States Navy had the worst. Fully a third of the shells were dysfunctional. And so Jim rented a garage in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, a garage being a used car dealership that had failed. And with several Navy technicians, these are young men and women with 2 and 3 stripes, he began to experiment with something called a proximity fuse. And then he proceeded to rent 40 acres of farmland in Montgomery County, the county surrounding where Chevy Chase is. And he would experiment just like people would with fireworks. And then someone told him one day that there were a lot of spies in Washington. He needed to carry a gun. So they made him a deputy sheriff of Montgomery County so he could carry a gun. Well, soon thereafter, he developed something that worked. And worked in the sense that all it did, what's called proximity fuse, that he then patented, by the way, was increase the firepower of the United States Navy by 50%. That is, it went from 66, 67% firepower to 99+%. Well, that is a rather extraordinary phenomenon. He then proceeded to work on something with smaller shells, and these were anti-aircraft. And in this case, he had some assistants who were actual physicists, and they developed the first smart weapon ever developed in the history of the world. That is, a shell that could kind of home in on an object. After developing it, though, he found that the Navy in particular, but nobody in anti-aircraft area wanted to use it. And the reason they didn't want to use it is that they loved ACAT. And all of you can kind of remember from World War II movies the pop, pop, pop of these anti-aircraft shells going off. Well, we never thought about it much, but that means they missed. And so Jim, who'd had a letter from an admiral that said to give him top priority for requisitions, used this letter, or a similar one, and he requisitioned a ship to go into the Pacific. And he loaded it with his shells, and he went ship by ship by ship in the United States Navy and talked the captains and the gunners into replacing their shells with his shells. So he was the salesman for his own shells. It happened that he got the Navy convinced just about the time, just before a battle took place called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval engagement in man's history. And the Japanese sent, for the first time, a massive kamikaze attack in the United States fleet. 41 kamikazes were sent. His shells knocked down 38. ACAC would have gotten 0. And this is the case because these planes come in low. The statistics on his shell versus the ACAC were about a 7-to-1 greater hit ratio than existed before. Anyway, there was another Iowa City resident that I learned a lot about today. Colonel Dick Feddersen came by my office and gave me some material about a man named Donald Mack Showers. And Donald Showers was brought up in the south of Iowa City here. His father was on the faculty at the university. And when World War II hit, he also joined the Navy. And as a young intelligence officer, he was part of a very small group that all they did was take the Japanese code and, in effect, dissect it. And, in effect, we had the capacity in the war in Japan, against Japan, to know everything they were doing based upon our ability to read their code. In any regard, then a young intelligence officer became an admiral in the Navy, and later a senior intelligence officer with the United States Central Intelligence Agency. He received commendations from both, as, by the way, did Jim Van Allen, who in 1946 received a commendation signed by the Secretary of the Navy that began with this sentence: "No individual is more responsible for the success of the United States Navy in World War II than Lieutenant Junior Grade James Van Allen." Well, that's a rather extraordinary phenomenon when you think about this city at this time. We also, on the European front, broke the German code. In fact, it preceded the Japanese code, and some of the same techniques were used. We know, when you think about D-Day, that the Germans didn't know that was the single landing. Well, intriguingly, almost of as much importance was that we knew that they didn't know. And we knew that because we could follow all of their communications. And that ended up being incredibly consequential because we could have shifted policy if we knew something different. Now, the reason I referenced the European front briefly, my father landed at Omaha Beach and was the executive officer of a regiment that was the 4th most casualty inflicted of the war. And he never talked about the war much, but I'll never forget the time there was something in the news about a great story that had just broken with the American news, and that had gotten some intelligence gathering data involved in it. And my father said, you know, there must have been hundreds of Americans that knew that D-Day was only a single landing of those two places, Omaha and Utah beaches, but they were virtually next to each other. But no one told. And my father said, I'm confident some of the American press at that time knew too. But no one would have dreamed of telling. And that is what has changed in some ways in this world that we now live. Now, I mentioned these men and what they went through, and particularly the founders, because when you think about our political system, is there any evidence that any founder, that any major American political figure in the 19th century ever suggested that the goal of governance should be dysfunctionality? And we were very philosophical when we began our republic. That is, not only did we decide that society should be based on the rights of man, but people looked at human nature. The founders were moral philosophers as well as political activists. And based upon what they considered to be a dual nature of human nature, that is, that man was worthy of having rights, but he also had some weaknesses and therefore should be watched very carefully. Therefore, we should have a government that would be divided into branches of government and also levels of government. And so we have a system in this country in which you have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch of the United States government, and then you have it triplicated at the state level, at the county level, and at the city level, where we have analogs, a legislature, an executive, and a judicial function. And I mention this because we made it hard to have functionality, but we assumed that people would be wise enough that they could work together. And right now we have a very different setting. We have a divided House. We have a Senate that is absolutely riven with dysfunctional features because of its rules. And we have a circumstance that people don't seem to be able to get along, and people also have vested interests not to get along. And that not to get along is new in the American political process. And so let me just go into a little bit why we have dysfunctionality and then what the meaning of it is, why it occurs. In one sense, there is very good reason for the American people to be angst-ridden today. We are just finishing, maybe, the two longest and certainly the most debilitating wars in our history. We've had an economic recession of some depth and rather tepid growth that's followed it. We have debt levels that have risen dramatically and no sight of them being government budgets being put in balance, at least at the federal level. And we've had something very unusual in American history and very discouraging. We've seen over the last generation, basically, the disparities between very well-to-do people and less well-to-do people widened dramatically. And this is a novel in our history. These events have been exacerbated over time by a series of things happening in the political process. And I stress time, but with a philosophical precept. Sometimes there is a difference in degree that at some point trips into becoming a difference in kind. And so this stark partisanship has grown over the last 20 years, but it's truly tripped into something that we've never seen before. And that doesn't mean that we haven't had harsh times in American history. When you think about it, the decade before the Civil War, when a House member wandered over to the Senate and almost caned to death a United States senator, that was not perfect. Although many people in the House think it was a high moment for the House, but there was, in one sense, reason for it. That is, the reason being it was a true division in America when you had this question of slavery. In the Deep South, slaves represented 1/2 of the GDP of the South. This was a deeply embedded thing that people were going to lose a lot if slavery was ended. And so what you had was feelings that were based upon true reasons for division. Now, we all recognize that the Southern case is not a very compelling one. In fact, it's a morally despicable one. On the other hand, there was reason for this tension and reason that a war occurred. Today, we have a circumstance that some people talk about just with real casualness, the notion of cultural wars. Well, there are real cultural differences in America, but do you apply the word war to it? When you apply the word war to it, does that make you think differently? And we have now people that are rather intolerant. And one of the great questions is, are we better off as a society with a lot of variety? And isn't that fun and culture? Or are we better off with everyone thinking just alike and looking at art the same way, looking at music the same way? And actually, in my view, a culture of diversity is vastly preferable to a culture of homogeneity. But to many people, it's not that at all. Now, when we come to political science, when I left the Congress at the invitation of my constituents, and by the way, my family and I are fully convinced constituents were correct. But when I look back on this generation of politics, and I entered the teaching profession, I developed 45 or 50 what I called 2-minute courses in American governance, and I'm going to give half a dozen tonight and then some other observation. But the first course I call Political Science 101. And it's rather simple. In the last generation, although it's not exactly the case today, we're about 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democratic, and about 1/3 no party. Well, you cut 1/3 in half. If you're mathematical, you know that that's 1/6. So 1/6 of the American people control the Republican Party, 1/6 the Democratic. But in legislative circumstances, in primaries, and it's even more extreme in caucuses, at most 1 in 4 participate. Often it's 1 in 8, 1 in 12. But let's say big participation, it's 1 in 4. Well, you multiply 1/4 times 1/6 and you get 1/24. So 1/24 of the American people control the nominees for the Republican Party, 1/24 for the Democratic. And then you ask yourself, who is the 1/24? And on the Democratic side, it's quite liberal, but it's quite stable, and it's basically teachers, academics, and organized labor. On the Republican side, it's quite conservative, but the name conservative has taken on different connotations. When I entered political life, a conservative was a strong supporter of Barry Goldwater. Today, Barry Goldwater would be a left-wing Republican. And this is true because Barry was pro-choice, he was pro-gay rights. And that, in today's Republican Party, is pretty liberal. Now, I mention this because we have activism that is really rather strong and nominees that are pretty far to one extreme in both parties, although extreme may be a little harsh a term to use. But if you go to the chemistry of people that hold positions of each nature, and you visualize the people that are like that, and they're people that don't normally just get along at all. I mean, they're not people that choose to be next-door neighbors. Political Science 102 is a course, and by the way, our founders were very strong in the idea that they wanted and expected a Congress to be made up of people with vast varieties. They were thinking basically geographic, and they were thinking by occupations. That is, farmers, merchants, seamen, possibly a professional or two, religious or legal, and that would form a vibrant kind of Congress. But today, there is one group that is massively underrepresented in the United States Congress, and it's called the center left and the center right. Today, there is virtually no one from either direction. And part of it relates, again, back to the primaries. To get a nomination, one has to be somewhat to the left as a Democrat, somewhat to the right as a Republican. Then, if that person, once elected, decides to do something with someone of the other party on some bill, to compromise, whatever, the certitude is that someone from his constituency will say, well, we need a real conservative or a real liberal to represent us, and they will have a primary challenge. And today, about 85% of House seats at the national level are safe with one party or another. And that means that in a tangible way, the only way someone gets defeated in most cases is now from a primary rather than the general election. And if that's the case, there is real incentive for a person not to compromise. In other words, the incentive is to get along and go along with the majority in the party, and the party is going to be both quite conservative and quite liberal. Now, the course I call Political Science 102 is a little bit different. Half of this course everybody knows, the other half they don't think about. And the half that's known is that if two people in this room are running for president, one is a Democrat and one is a Republican, it's expected each moves a little bit to the right or to the left in the primary, and then there's kind of a scoot to the middle in the general election if they're nominated. However, in Congress, it's the same thing to get nominated, but there's no scoot to the middle, because if you scoot to the middle, you're much more likely to lose your job. And for many people in politics, job maintenance is a pretty high goal. The last question I'm going to give on why all of this relates to what I call, a course I call Physics 101. And that is that everybody knows a guy named Isaac Newton had 3 laws of nature. And the third one was, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, one day on the House floor, I discovered the 4th Newtonian law. And I discovered this as a pun. It was an absolute shot out of the air that I hadn't been doing research on. But I was watching the then Speaker of the House, whose name was Newt, so this is a Newtonian law, give a fairly critical critique of the Democratic Party. And I was watching my friends on the Democratic side, and it dawned on me that in social physics, unlike natural physics, reaction can be greater than action. And so if I were to call someone in this room a bum, they might respond with something a little tougher back. In foreign affairs, if one calls a country evil, maybe the reaction will be, gosh, I have to change, but it's much more likely to be, you're satanic. And so words can make a difference. Now, why does all of this matter? One reason it matters is that people expect government and governance to work. And if it doesn't work, one loses a great deal of respect, and that can have lots of implications for stability in an economy. It can also have lots of implications for leadership of the world. And I don't know how many of you have traveled abroad recently, but I will tell you, around the world, people are really, really quizzical in a quite negative sense. And the number of years that we've gone through life basically being so confident that our system was so much better than anybody else's. And now we're a little bit embarrassed about ourselves. And I personally think our system is still preeminent, but how it's currently being manipulated, I think, has some real questions to be raised. The second thing I'd like to mention is another course in physics. And this one relates to a guy named Einstein. And Einstein, in probably the most profound political science observation of the 20th century, at least of modern times, said that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And what he meant by that was that we now have the ability not just to wage war, but destroy life on the planet. And no society has ever had that before. No world environment has ever had that before. And that means you have to think in different ways. And you have to relate to people in different ways. And you have to be cognizant. And again, I go back to the founders. If you remember in this initial document of ours, the Declaration of Independence, there's this phrase, with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. And that's very different than just assuming that one is always correct. And again, one of the other courses I used to joke about was one I called Literature 101. When I was in college, the kind of the fashionable set of books that one might read were a group of 4 books by a guy named Lawrence Durrell, who was a Britisher who wrote something called the Alexandria Quartet, which is 4 books that were set between World War I and World War II in Alexandria, Egypt. And the interesting aspect of these books were that they were 4 books, each titled by the name of a person who was a participant in a set of events. And the events were the same in each of the 4 novels. And the only thing that was different was that the events were told from the eyes of a different participant. And the literary moral was that you couldn't get a sense for reality unless you saw something from more than one set of eyes. In fact, these were 4 radically different stories, even though they were about the same events. And so when you think of American politics, when you think of the dinner table, just many things that look to one person like it's pretty obvious what occurred, to someone else they look very different. When one thinks of a courtroom, for example, you can have 2 people testifying exactly opposite things, and both are telling the total truth from their perspective. And so to me, it's pretty evident that if you take national politics, that it's helpful to have people from a lot of different backgrounds, from a lot of different perspectives. And it's helpful in international relations to wonder how an African might look at something, how an Asian might, how a Middle Easterner might, how a European might. And that doesn't mean that one necessarily changes one's view of what is the right course of action, but it can modulate it to more than a small extent. Well, let me just end with, on this why it matters also. Words can matter a great deal. And that doesn't mean that divisive words haven't been common in the American political process. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson hired a reporter who described John Adams as a hermaphrodite. When I first read that, I had to go to a dictionary, and in any regard, it wasn't a compliment. But we've seen in recent years, George W. Bush was called a fascist. Barack Obama has been called a fascist and a communist, sometimes by the same people at the same time. And what's the problem with a little bit of hyperbole? Well, the answer is plenty, because if you take these 2 words, which are in many ways vastly worse than hermaphrodite, because they have warring implications. 400,000 Americans lost their lives defeating fascism. Tens of thousands holding communism at bay, and we've spent trillions of dollars to build up, to defend against communism. Well, if you think your president is a fascist or a communist, does that not imply that you might be obligated to do something pretty horrendous? And also, does it mean that you're going to have a hard time following law? And then you add to that, one of the most disturbing phenomenons of modern times, and luckily it didn't apply to many Iowans, but statistically, over half of all Texans believe Barack Obama was not born in Hawaii. And one of the difficulties of that issue is that's another way of saying he's an unconstitutional president. If you have an unconstitutional president, do you pay your taxes? I mean, why do you support an unconstitutionally led government? I mean, these are really difficult thought processes that we have to think through. Now, in Western civilization, we have a poem that's probably our most prophetic, and this was one written right after World War I by William Butler Yeats called The Second Coming. And in it he says, the center cannot hold when the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And what he was writing about was really in reaction to what was perhaps the most traumatic circumstance in the history of war to that time, and it was the trench warfare of World War I, where tens of thousands of people were just killed in what looked, in retrospect, like a war with virtually no rationale behind it, and looks like a war with strategies that had no sense, but they were lethal. But when you think of today, I think that for very different reasons, these words have some sort of relevance. How much is a judgment call for anyone in this room. Well, I stress into the politics of politics a bit because they do form a challenge to how we govern ourselves. They also hold a challenge to national security itself. And some of the issues have been made worse. We have a great balancing institution in American society called the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the court has entered into the fray of doing the irrational. And I consider the second worst decision in the history of the United States Supreme Court to be something called Citizens United. In the worst decision of the court, well, the worst decision of the court was in 1857 in a decision called Dred Scott. The Supreme Court of the United States held that an individual could be treated as property and be bought and sold. In Citizens United, they do an inverse kind of logic. They say that a corporation, which is a kind of property, holds rights of an individual. So the first is that an individual's property. This one is property is an individual. And based on that, these two, and a second fundamental assumption that money is speech, the court has held that a corporation has First Amendment rights under the Constitution of the United States, and you cannot circumscribe First Amendment rights. And what that means is that we are moving American society away from being a democracy of a representative nature to being a democracy that is increasingly corporatist. And it is just beginning. This thing has just started to be understood and take shape, and it's going to have enormous implications that are going to alter the political DNA of the United States. What governance is about at the domestic level is basically how you tax, how you spend, and how you look at various policy initiatives. Excuse me just a second. In that regard, many people are properly very concerned with the debt levels that have started to be generated. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man named Mike Mullen, has suggested that debt alone is the greatest national security threat to the United States. And he says that because the Defense Department can no longer quite get any way it wants with the federal budget. And when national security is in jeopardy, that's a very serious phenomenon. Now, it's also tied into the reason our debt is in such lousy shape, and there are a number of reasons, but one is that these two longest wars that we have fought as a society, we've fought them in a way that no other country in our own country has never tried. these are the first wars in human history that have become financed with tax cuts. And that's really worthy of thinking through. We've cut taxes in wartime. And so we have a circumstance that the multi-trillion-dollar debt that we have is in more than partial measure because we haven't financed wars that we've undertaken in the very recent past. And I will tell you, we don't know the precise dimensions, but it looks like it's somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion of costs of these wars. That means it's vastly greater than the cost of Obamacare. Now, there are ways of looking at Obamacare that says it's a no-cost option. I personally think that there's going to be some cost, but it's not near the cost of wars. And so one can have whatever view one wants on a new change in health care, but the perspective that really has to be applied to it, what else is added to the cost of the United States government. Now, there are two dynamic theories of economic behavior that are tied into the debt issue. One involves a paradigm of looking at the economy that comes from John Maynard Keynes with his modern-day proponent, Paul Krugman. And that is very simple. When times are tough, when there's a national emergency, it can be helpful to deficit finance. Then there is another economic, basically, paradigm that comes from an Austrian named Friedrich Hayek and his modern-day apostle, Milton Friedman. And they argue that it's better to use monetary policy than fiscal policy if stimulus is needed. And by all accounts, or by any account, one should be very careful about raising taxes. Interestingly, at this time, we have followed both of these economic paradigms. That is, debt has been raised rather substantially. Taxes, and this is a surprise to the American people, the statement I'm going to make, are being held at a lower level than under the Reagan administration. And monetary policy has been used in rather extraordinary ways. It's my personal view, frankly, that the Federal Reserve, as a regulator, erred a bit in not putting enough emphasis on certain kinds of controls on the banking system. But since the fall of a bank called Lehman, it's the Federal Reserve that saved the American economy, largely through monetary policy. Now, I mention this because the challenge is one of balance, and how do you arrive at balance? And it's a dilemma that we all have, and if in politics it's difficult, it's a national trauma. Now, here I might mention an historical anecdote, and then presume a contemporary speculation. And the anecdote is, the father of Republican economics is Alexander Hamilton. And the one thing Hamilton is best known for is that against populist tide, he insisted, and George Washington concurred, that the Revolutionary War debt of the United States be paid, and that would make a country safer and secure in the long term. And frankly, it's difficult for me to visualize how either a Hamiltonian, how either a disciple of John Maynard Keynes or Milton Friedman could possibly believe that it's proper to toy with the full faith and credit of the United States government. And all that introducing uncertainty into the economic climate does is make it more likely that interest rates go up higher than they would have been before, and one never knows what that is because one doesn't know what it would have been before. And that makes government more expensive, able to do less, in a time that fewer jobs are likely to be created. And so if there's anything that there is a responsibility of anyone in public life, it's to try to make reasonable decisions on how government should be managed. And dysfunctionality should not be one of the lists of things to do or seek. Well, let me just conclude with what I consider to be the biggest dilemma in America today, and that is that this country has never been better led in the arts, in the academy, in business, in the professions, and yet the political system is letting the country down. And it doesn't mean that there aren't some very good people in it. There are some very decent members of Congress. The executive branch has some excellent people. The president is a very capable man. But my concern is, and I relate this as in a kind of a wordsmithing way back to Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower once warned of a political military complex. Well, my concern today is for a political ideological complex. That is, ideologues use politicians as pawns, and politicians use ideologues to advance their personal ambition. And in all of this, if you take political philosophy or common sense, but political philosophy historically is talked about the common good. The Brits in the 19th century had a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham who talked about the greatest good of the greatest number. But where have you heard people use words like common good? Where have you heard a congressman say, I'm going to vote for this because it's the common good? These are words that have left the vocabulary of American politics. And so I'm going to end with first a reference to an event that occurred yesterday and lead into this. The event that occurred yesterday was a women's basketball game at the University of Iowa, where Iowa played the 14th ranked team in the country. And Iowa won in overtime, but what was truly interesting to me was how terrific all these athletes seemed as people. And that everyone there at the arena was, of course, for the Hawkeyes, but I don't think there was a soul in the audience that didn't like the opposing team. They looked like they had great kids. And everything about it was sport. And it made me think, and I used to call this a course too, called Sports 101, that we had this journalist 75 years ago. I can't even visualize him, but all of us have heard his name, called Grantland Rice, who talked about winning and losing isn't the most important thing, it's how you play the game. Well, in politics, the temper and the integrity of the political discourse is probably more important than the outcome of any election. And yet people don't think in these terms. And when I entered the political fray myself, I used to make these one-to-one analogies between sports and politics, partly because I played 3 sports in college and I just really, that was my background. But the more I've looked at it, it's so self-evident that the sports ethic, despite the problems we hear from an egoistic athlete now and again, but the sports ethic is so much higher than the political ethic. And part of it's the case because there are referees in sports. There are no referees in politics. Part of it's the case, and let me just give an example. If the president of the University of Iowa hired a coach, and the coach taught his kids not to respect the opponent, how many people think that Sally Mason wouldn't let the guy go or the gal go? In politics, there are coaches too. They're called political consultants. And there is no such thing as a political consultant in America today who in a close race will not tell the candidate, you've got to go negative. And everything is about disrespect. And so I'll just conclude with, because the analogy that exists is that we're a competitive society in many, many ways. Free markets, what our interests are. We're just simply a very competitive society. But there is no reason that politics should not have as high an ethic as the American sports ethic and cannot serve us better. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Let me, your time. Thank you. Let me just throw it open to any questions you might have. And I'm told someone may have cards to pass around. I don't know if that works. Maybe it's as easy just to raise your hand. I must tell you, I'm slightly disadvantaged because I have bright lights on me, and it's not perfectly easy for me to see, particularly in the back. Yes. Well, first of all, one has to be cautious. Never underestimate the electorate. There are people that like to talk down to electorates, and there are people that like to manipulate electorates. And there are a lot of aspects of the American political process that I don't see an early cure to. But I do think the American public can get quite well educated, and that there's no reason not to. In fact, even though we've had an enormous weakening in the American newspaper industry, it's astonishing how much access there is to information and perspectives that the American public now has in so many different ways. Now, one of the problems that exist is that one of the real competitive things that's happening is between people who try to look at things from more than one perspective, who try to read a variety of things, and people who read or see things that they choose from a single perspective to begin with. And this is true internationally, and it's true domestically. And so one of the challenges is to make sure that people get a wider perspective. Now, some things that are happening in America are frankly quite progressive, and I think led less by the political community than the media. And by this I mean particularly not the news media, but attitudes, for example, for gay rights. Clearly much more progressive in each passing year. Attitudes towards people of color is truly changing. If we look at where America was 50 years ago compared to today, and then look at it 100 years ago, I mean, this truly has changed. In some ways, our country in the 19th century was ridden with attitudes towards religion where Catholicism was shunned by many people. Today, that's not the case at all. Although we have new issues, there are greater divisions to some degree between some of the fundamentalist faiths and some of the more so-called mainstream faiths. But the country has made progress that is fairly impressive in many different ways. And I don't particularly think it's been led by politics. I think politics has often followed. Yes. Ah, good. Well, actually, I think there's growing consensus that we do something about debt. Where there's no consensus is how to do it. Because the last thing you want to hear a public official say is it's got to be something where you give a little bit on taxes as well as give a little bit on benefits. But now there are a lot of people that will not look at the tax side of it. So then you have the question, if you don't look at the tax side, who is going to be hurt by it? And in this particular atmosphere, clearly poor people are going to be most hurt. Now then there is a one-time opportunity, if government had the discipline to do it, to actually lower tax rates and get rid of virtually all of the individual special kinds of deductions. And that way you can say you're not raising tax rates. But of the individual kinds of deductions, there are a couple things that clearly are going to have to be kept. I mean, everything from for example, nonprofit giving to mortgages, at least up to a given point, are kind of the two things that are bedrocks with the American people. Virtually every other kind of deduction is for one group or another, and every group has a terrific case for it if another group has a deduction. But the special interest deductions are basically belong to somebody else. And so whether or not you can change the tax codes to bring more rationality to it, not necessarily simply on the raising of taxes, but to make it the code more rational to be based upon principally rates rather than deductions. I mean, that's a way to go about it. Now the trouble is that the current prospects are high that the deficit reduction will be on lower income people burden, or an extra burden hit on them. But whether you can change that at all, I don't know. Now it's being changed in New York City. I mean, a mayoral candidate that got basically half the vote with a lot of candidates against him has said he's going to raise taxes on the well-to-do, which is in some sense kind of a gutsy thing to do in New York. Now I have a question here. Would term limits be helpful? Can the no label agenda help Congress work better? Well, first let me say the no label campaign agenda is a really I consider very constructive new movement in American politics to try to push people for seeking more moderate views in the middle. On the term limits issue, there's always a case for term limits. I certainly think I probably stayed too long. But I will tell you it's of minor significance compared to the money in politics issue. And money in politics is overwhelmingly the problem. I really think that I used to say that I was generally a fairly moderate voting record, but on campaign finance, I was an absolute radical. I mean, I truly think you've got to change the public, the way we finance elections, and that's going to happen. And unfortunately, it's going to have to begin with Citizens United. This question is, what can we do to break the gridlock? And if you were in Congress, what would you do? Well, first, that last question I no longer have to speculate about. There are a lot of aspects of the gridlock, and some things that exist that move things to the right and left, one has to totally respect. That is, Someone in this room may like the position of an activist group in the Democratic side or an activist group on the Republican side, but the fact is you have to respect anyone that chooses to participate. And then the question is, if you don't like the preponderance of people that participate, it might be helpful to try to grow the participation of other people. And so my personal view is the weakest part of the American political process, other than money in politics, is the primary system. And you don't think about that. So, I mean, people don't talk about the primary so much. I'm a citizen, I'm going to vote for the president in November. But you don't think about the primary to the same degree. But it's the primary that chooses the candidates and sets the agenda for platforms. And so the goal is to build it up. Now, there is new talk in the Republican Party of those that want to broaden bases, that caucuses don't work as well as primaries because caucuses involve fewer people. Now, Iowa has the best caucus to defend if you like caucuses because it's bigger than any other state's caucuses. And it gets the first in the national agenda. But other states that have gone to caucuses are really talking de minimis numbers of people that participate. And I don't think that can be healthy for the system. Also, Iowa's pretty good about an open primary on where you're not in a caucus setting, and so someone here can be a registered Democrat and go in and vote in a primary for a Republican, and that changes one's registration. Many states have really tight rules on this, and I think the more open the rule, Iowa has a good system. People have pointed to the issue of gerrymandering, and everybody kind of knows what gerrymandering is, but it's a subject of about as much intense interest as talking about someone else's genealogy. It is truly, actually, genealogy is a wonderfully interesting subject within one's own family. And it gives a sense of history, a sense of where one is from, all sorts of things. But someone else's genealogy does not really ring great interest to many people. And that's the problem with gerrymandering, that it is truly a difficult circumstance, but it doesn't gravitate in many ways. Now, Iowa has one of the best laws in America on the subject, this idea that but just simply the principle that we turn it over to a nonpartisan group. The legislature has an up and down vote. If it goes down, they have another crack. If it goes down, basically it goes to the Supreme Court to set the districts. Iowa has one aspect that's a little more discombobulating than any other state, and that's a state constitutional provision that says that counties can't be divided for congressional redistricting. And so that means that every decade, to get the lowest numerical differentiation between however many congressional seats the state will have at a given point in time, one does a whole lot of manipulation of counties around, and that means a lot of change because the counties all have different populations with each decade census because you have internal migration. And so it means that Iowa has a system that really has probably as much change and as much fairness in the redistricting process as any state. But the examples of gerrymandering are pretty awkward. Some gerrymandering, though, some that's called gerrymandering is not exactly, because it's next to impossible, let's say, in the heart of Chicago to draw out a Republican district. You just can't. And so you have natural Democratic districts, and there are some parts of America that have natural Republican districts. But there are a number of districts that are also manipulated by the state legislature for one party or the other. The question is, how might youth address the problem of political gridlock? Well, I think youth have options to do a lot of things that people don't think about. But youth have a way of looking at the world that today is really quite idealistic and rather extraordinary. In addition, we think of, can a youngster be part of the political process? And the answer is yes. I remember when I first very tentatively stubbed my toe and said I would consider being a candidate, and I had a knock on my door, and it was a brother-sister combination from up the street of 6 and 8 years of age. And they ended up carrying nomination papers all over our area, and they got more nomination papers for me than anyone I'd ever worked with. How can you turn down a 6-year-old coming to the door? I mean, and the probability is people sign with their fingers crossed, but anyway, that's one can play a role at any age. And by the way, also, and I want to address the other end of the spectrum, political candidacy can come at any stage of life. And there's no reason that someone, when they retire from a bank, from the University of Iowa, from whatever, shouldn't consider running for office. And so one can run for office at 21 or 81. And these are all options, and I think they're, a reverend could also run, sir. Something that ought to be thought about by people. One of the hardest things in public life is that lots of people consider running for office that never do. And part of it relates to, it's hard to make that step because there is a little bit of gall. I mean, if someone were to step forward and say, I want to be your state legislature, that takes gall. Now, all I can tell you is I remember when I first announced how my leg was shaking. Then you get a little too used to it, and it doesn't, and I think that's bad. But in fact, I will tell you a footnote. I stood behind the President of the United States. Well, he wasn't then the president when he first announced for the presidency, and his leg was shaking like mad. I mean, but I found it charming, basically because I'd experienced it before, not for that office. Okay, how do we move back to some balance in politics with a focus on functionality? Well, that's the great question. I mean, some is to look at the structural issues in American politics, and some is to look on an individual basis. I mean, I would love to see someone do a drive of have a candidate sign something, and just for the whole country, which it would be something like, I pledge that on any issue I will agree to listen to the other side and where possible work with the other side. And I'll tell you, that's going to embarrass some candidates. And then it's how one could not sign it, I don't know. But I think it'd be a very interesting thing to have a drive that would do that and see how people would respond to it. But there would be a lot of people that would say, we don't want that. We want you in the nose of the other guy. And so maybe if there were two people in the primary and one signed and one didn't, it might help the person who didn't. I don't know. But it's an interesting thought. What about leftists' refusal to admit big government programs have not worked? Well, there are some programs that haven't worked, and there are some programs that are pretty impressive. I mean, I'll give you an example of a well-intended program that needed some architectural help, and I mean this quite literally. Housing is a very important thing for people, and in the 60s and 70s we developed some inner city housing programs, and we developed some big high-rises. And it was found that a big inner city high-rise on government assistance didn't work. But that didn't mean you ended help for people on housing, but it was found that you could, if you had a low-rise, or if you had some sort of the equivalent, and I hate the word because I don't like the word, voucher, that you get people to go and rent somewhere, that can be a far more manageable way than putting all people with difficulties in one place. And these might be simply financial difficulties, but often with financial difficulties come other difficulties, and they become centers for drug distribution, etc. It just doesn't work. And so based on this, Democratic administrations began the process of tearing down inner city high-rises. I mean, that is something that didn't work, although the thought behind it was quite reasonable. One other aspect of this, people would be surprised to know that the historic discretionary budget of the United States, which relates to domestic affairs of a programmatic nature, is as low a percentage relative to GDP that it's been in 40 or 50 years today. And what the federal government has done is move in a direction of direct money transfers, for example, Social Security, and other kinds that are different than programs themselves. Now, some of this is rational, some may be imperfectly rational. Milton Friedman used to argue in the 60s that when Lyndon Johnson established a, quote, poverty program, that what was it? And it was a bunch of programs for people. And Milton said he didn't understand the definition of poverty. And what is poverty, he asked. He said, well, poverty is lack of money. Therefore, instead of having programs, one should have direct money transfers. And so he was an advocate of something called the negative income tax, which means that some people would receive actual income instead of paying income, and we now have a version of that in existence today. But the reason I mention it is I think there's a role for some programs. There's also a role for other ways of dealing with issues than simply programmatic. Gridlock, Gridlock, a debilitating cultural challenge. Is this significantly different from your title? How? It's different, but I agree with this title that's been given to me because I happen to really like the word debilitating. Because when things don't work and you have high expectations, it is debilitating. And all of us, of Americans, have high expectations for our government. And when it isn't working perfectly, it's debilitating. And so this cultural challenge, it's not by intent a different than my title, I will tell you, but I like your title better. How can Citizens United be overturned? Well, the intriguing phenomenon is that there cannot be a legislative overturn. There's a possibility a legislature might pass a law that has a little bit more transparency that the court would accept. But if the court's, by its 5-4 majority today, keeps the same thinking, it cannot significantly be changed unless there's a change in the court or unless there's a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments are very difficult to develop. They involve supermajorities in both bodies. They don't, by the way, involve a presidential signature. And then they take, I think it's 3/4 of the states to ratify. Maybe it's 2/3, but I think it's 3/4. But a constitutional amendment could override Citizens United. Should politicians, parents, congressmen, and senators have term limits? Should some politicians agree to be subject to laws they pass for constituents? PAC money contributions. Well, it's a rational case about term limits. There also is a judgment call on how long. There are some disadvantages people should know. I mean, one is that like all businesses, all occupations in life, it takes a little while to learn how to be a representative. And then if you think about Congress for a moment, that in a way, as a legislative body, there's truly no issue in the world that cannot come under one's jurisdiction. And so Congress breaks down by committees. I used to say that the very best and the brightest and the most senior members knew about 2% of what was happening in Congress. Now I think that's probably high. And I mean that. I mean, how do you know the subtleties of tax policy, and coupled with transportation policy, coupled with health care, coupled with foreign affairs, the problems in South Africa, the problems in Nigeria, the problems in Myanmar. I mean, there's just a limit. And so as someone that was in the arena, I will tell you, you try to specialize. And so it's good to have a limited number of committees. Now, in the House of Representatives, you could be on the whole generally on 2 committees. In the Senate, because they have the same committees, but they're 1 to 4.35 members, and so a senator is on 4 or 5 committees, or 6 sometimes. And it's one reason why on committees of jurisdiction, often House members know more than senators. But senators run their committees through their staff, and so the staffs can be quite able. But it is really hard to be on top of very much. And so when you talk about stern term limits, you're also talking about, you're accepting the thought that people won't know very much about what they're doing. Now, some people suggest that empowers staff, and it probably does, and so you have a permanent bureaucracy to some degree. But I have a friend who was in a debate with his opponent. His opponent said he was for 6-year term limits, and my friend had been in office for 15 or 20 years, and he said, I have a much more radical position. And the moderator said, what's that? And he said, I'm for a 1-term limit unless the public votes otherwise. I would just tell you, I mean, there's a case each way, but the really strong case is money. Money is the really debilitating part of our system today. Boy, what would be needed to change gridlock? I think one has to look at the money, one has to look at processes. We just have to get more involved. And the trauma is, when a public thinks things are kind of debilitating, there can be 2 reactions. One reaction is, let's get involved. The other reaction is, why bother? And it's going to be very interesting to me to see whether we're going to get bigger or lesser participation in the next elections. I don't know. It's a very great question. Now, Australia, I think, has an interesting law. And I don't know just how it works, but they find someone that doesn't vote. So it's kind of an inverse incentive to vote. Well, I think I've answered all the yellow pages. Thank you very much.